and I want to welcome you to tonight's forum on climate change and threats to democracy. My name is Leah Robshaw Robinson, and I'm the Executive Director of Friends for a NonViolent World. It is an honor to be moderating tonight's event. This forum is brought to you by the Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers. Founded in 1995, the Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers, or MAP, is a coalition now comprising of over 70 organizations. MAP's mission is to strengthen the effectiveness of the peace and justice community in Minnesota by enabling member organizations to share their resources, insights, and ideas, and devise cooperative strategies to accomplish common goals. On behalf of everyone at MAP, I welcome you. As you arrive, I invite you to take a moment to share your name, pronouns, and what brought you here tonight in the chat. So, this is a critical time for the future of the US and our planet. Are we in denial about threats to our democracy? Can we tackle climate change if we're not a democracy? And importantly, what can we do? Yes, I'm seeing strong sense of urgency, people broadening their perspectives. I think that this is a very pressing, very critical topic that we're going to be exploring. And I want to emphasize that exploring these questions, it's more than a theoretical and intellectual discussion. It is the story of our lived experiences. It's the history of our ancestors, and it is our collective future. I want to name that tonight's topic is an emotional topic. And it is okay to bring your whole self into this space and to experience feelings that may arise in you tonight. It's really real. And as I'm seeing the reasons that people are here, I can feel that passion and that emotion that you're bringing. So as we begin, I invite you to join me in grounding. We can ground ourselves in our bodies. So I invite you to take 2 deep breaths with me. Just let it in, let it out. Let it come, let it go. I invite you to roll your shoulders back and feel the support of your chair, support of the ground. And I invite you, if you're able, to press your hand to your heart and feel its beating in your body. Notice your breath. Your breath and heart are available to you tonight. And I invite you to keep checking in with your body during our time together. And you can use your breath to ground yourself as needed. So again, on behalf of everyone at the Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers, I welcome you to tonight's forum on democracy and threats to climate change. My name's Leah Robshaw Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of Friends for a NonViolent World, and it's an honor to be moderating tonight's event. We are going to turn off the chat during the first part of our forum so that we can focus our full attention on what Sam and Jack have to share with us. We will turn it back on for a Q&A time at the end. I'd like to do a little land acknowledgement, and you can consider your own land where you are residing. But I'm going to acknowledge that my house here in Minneapolis, where I'm zooming in from, is located on the homeland of the Dakota people. And the Dakota have lived here for many thousands of years. The Anishinaabe people reside here too, and indigenous people from other tribal nations also reside here, and all have made innumerable contributions to this community. As we consider the topic of our forum tonight, it's important to acknowledge that both the state of Minnesota and the United States government carried out genocide, ethnic cleansing, and forced removal against the Dakota people as a way to acquire this land. Our governments broke promises, and this history is a part of our nation's story. But despite generations of colonial theft and violence, this is still Indigenous land and will always be Indigenous land. We are so fortunate to be here tonight in the company of two phenomenal individuals who will be sharing their insights on the important topic of climate change and threats to democracy. Sam Leguizamon Grant is the Executive Director of Rainbow Research, and he's Co-op Manager for Embody Deep Democracy. He's the former Executive Director of MN350. Sam has a 30-plus year history of utilizing critical participatory action research on the intersectionality of racial, cultural, economic, gender, environmental, and geographic justice. Thank you for being with us tonight, Sam. Yeah. And Jack Nelson-Pallmeyer holds a master's degree in religion and is an associate professor of justice and peace studies at the University of St. Thomas. Jack is a nationally recognized teacher, writer, public speaker, and activist committed to nonviolent social change. He has focused his life and work on showing linkages between faith and critical political, economic, and social issues. Welcome, Jack. Okay, so for tonight's forum on climate change and threats to democracy, I'll be posing questions for Sam and Jack to answer. And then we'll also have a time for audience questions at the end. So my first question is, how do you define democracy as we enter into this conversation about the intersection of democracy and the climate crisis? So, Sam, would you start us off?
I'd love to, Leah. Thank you for starting us with that question. So to begin, I feel it is necessary to strongly critique democracy as we experience it and embody it in the present time, and reflect on possible democracies that we can midwife together so that we can attend to this climate crisis at full scale. Democracy happens in a community, and it only works if the community practices principled struggle with each other around questions of how we create conditions for the well-being of the earth and each other as earthlings. And I'm prefacing or emphasizing the word earthlings. We get caught up in our divisions. We're from America, we're from Turkey, we're from Kazakhstan, we're from, Iran, we're from, Mozambique, we're from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We are earthlings, and we're responsible for the flourishing of planet and people. And we can't do that as long as we live inside the traps of nationalism and all of the ways we've learned to be divided from each other. So we've divided ourselves into these bordered, imagined communities, the way that Benedict Anderson talks about it. And we've largely contrived our nations as vehicles of braided cultural, political, ecological, and economic will, not cooperatively with other nations, but largely against other nations. We think about the United Nations as something that brings us all together, and yet the veto power of the world's global North nations against the global South nations prevents the listening through the United Nations to the voice of the climate oppressed, in the same way that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's work has made strenuous efforts to advance consensus science to the point that the demands of climate justice are more integrated, and they're still not there. They're still not integrated. The United States prides itself on being the world's shining example of democracy, and yet it has yet to make amends for genocide and the perennial violation of treaty rights, as is exemplified by the failure to stop Line 3 here in Minnesota. And it has yet to make amends for slavery and Jim Crow and the continuing transmission of anti-Black violence as core to the organized American way. And I'm prefacing this notion of organized American way because we have a choice about social organization. Human systems are designed by human beings. We can change the design to address the triple evils that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about before he was assassinated, of militarism, of racism, and impoverishment. So I'm switching his word poverty to impoverishment to recognize that it's something that's organized and created by human systems. It's not something that's God ordained. It's not something we're born into. It's something socially constructed, and it can be deconstructed and transformed. So we need to imagine, along with Vandana Shiva and others, how we co-evolve Earth democracy at all scales. And I look forward to discussing how we get there. Jack? You're on mute, Jack. I don't know how that happened. It's not supposed to be possible, but you're on mute.
There you go, right?
There we go. There we go. So thank you. I'm going to provide a really simple definition for U.S. democracy, and then I'm going to offer somewhat of a critique of it, because from my vantage point, I think many reasonably progressive people I think we're underestimating the current threat to our democracy. And I think some of the reasons for that are rooted in the actual failures of our democracy prior to now. So I'd just like to highlight some of those things. So here, I just wrote down, we live in a representative democracy. And from my vantage point, that is simply about people freely electing representatives to carry out public policies that reflect their personal and social priorities. So we don't, at this point, live in a direct democracy. We live in a representative one. If that's going to work, we have to have free and fair elections, et cetera, et cetera. And people do that based on their own personal interests, but also their understanding of what it means to live in, hopefully, a fair and just and sustainable society. So to my concern that maybe we're underestimating the present crisis, and the reason for that has to do with, I think, the failures of our democracy that long preceded our present authoritarian moment. Here's just a few that I would name that are reasonably recent and have been part of the writing that I've done. Has been done often in relation to these kind of critiques. I'm just going to mention a few of them. The first would be the U.S. has a horrible track record of democracy in terms of our foreign policy. And that could go back a long ways, but I'll just say, following World War II, literally the way that the U.S. sought to influence the world after World War II was through supporting military dictatorships. And we did that all over the world. I'm not talking about a handful of countries. I'm talking about dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of countries, many of them relatively newly formed. We have a long history of overthrowing democracies, whether we're talking about Guatemala or Iran or many other places that we could name. I spent quite a bit of time in El Salvador in the 1980s, and just a couple of revealing things. One is the US-backed military dictatorships in El Salvador. When those became destabilizing, then what the US did was it used elections for undemocratic purposes. In other words, it carried out elections, but really the power wasn't with the elected government. The power resided elsewhere, and often in the US embassy. I led many groups of US citizens that went to El Salvador in the 1980s to try to figure out what the impact of US policies were. And one of the words that we had to tell people who traveled with us that they could not say in public was the word democracy, because the US-backed governments in El Salvador saw that as a subversive concept, subversive word. And in fact, the US supported national security states throughout Latin America. And the number one premise was that the military was the ultimate power source, and that democracies, people's influence, that was a problem. So again, I think myself as a reasonably progressive person, I think a lot of other people were aware of some of these things. And then there's the history of Jim Crow and leading to mass incarceration policies and all of those things that have taken place presumably within a flawed representative democracy. Money in politics, we're all aware of Citizens United, but it's even much more subtle than that. We're seeing it right now, that all you have to do is pick off 2 Democrats and you can block almost all meaningful reforms in the US Senate presently. So money in politics. Something that is beyond our conversation today, but I really believe that Dwight Eisenhower was right when he talked about the military-industrial complex and the influence that it has. I think we live in a fantasy world if we believe that the military is completely under civilian control and that policies are determined by civilians. So that influence is another. And then there are just profound things like the very structure of our democracy, in which the population of Utah in the Senate has as much influence as the population in California. It's a very, very, very undemocratic system that we live within. And that also translates into that two-party system that can be so problematic as well. But institutionally, that's the one structurally that we live with. And so some of you may know, I actually ran for public office one time, and I chose to do that as a very marginal Democrat who was very critical of the Democratic Party much of the time. And so I think there's probably other people in this forum tonight that we look at the Democratic Party and sometimes we shake our heads and we wonder why we're doing that. And yet within our system, that is probably still, I would argue, still important in some way. So the representative democracy is what we have, and we have these flaws that I've named, but within those flaws, there's still a lot of room for struggle, and there have been some successes as a result of the kind of organizing that Sam is talking about that needs to be at the heart of any healthy democracy. Yeah. But I would argue, and we'll talk more about this later, that all those things that I said does not provide any of us with an excuse to not recognize just how precarious the present moment is for our democracy, but also for the climate as a result of what is happening to our democracy.
Yes, Jack, that's a perfect segue into just analyzing what is different about this moment, or what is the status of our democracy in this moment in time? Where you say that we're underestimating this present crisis. I'll let you speak to that, and then Sam will have a chance to respond as well.
I'll say a few things. I've spoken a lot already, but I think for me, the biggest change is that, and this would be on a continuum. I think we're wrong to think that it's completely new. But we now have a Republican Party at its heart that does not believe in democracy, and in fact sees power, holding power, gaining power. That critical to that is the undermining of democratic institutions. We're seeing a stacking of the courts, and if we have another president at all similar to the one that we just had, we're going to be talking a lot more about the problems related to the stacking of courts, and we're already seeing the implications of that. And I would say that there's like a 5-prong problem, or 5 prongs in the Republican strategy, and I'll just name them here that are all part of this present moment. The first, and this isn't entirely new, but it is to use whatever influence the Republican Party has, and this is at all levels, to essentially make good governance impossible, to do whatever you can to thwart efforts to redistribute wealth, which could solve many of our problems, to strengthen unions, to address climate change, all of those things, or anything in the present moment to really fight the pandemic and try to respond creatively to that. And that's just a calculation that the way that we retake power and expand our power is to create as much dysfunction in the society as possible, and to prevent in this case, the Democratic Party and even grassroots movements from succeeding. So that's one prong. Another prong is just the orchestrated efforts that are going beyond the traditional gerrymandering to limit voters, whether we're talking about prisoners coming out of prison not being allowed to vote, with those kind of things, to just making the Jim Crow period look like it's back, and that is really, really important, because that combination of just those two things is creating space where it may be possible for Republicans to actually, quote unquote, win elections, unfair elections, but win them without having to steal them. But that's the third prong, is literally stealing elections and laying a foundation so that if you don't like the decision made in your state, you can elect alternative electors and get it through the courts and undo the results of an election. So literally stealing elections. The fourth one I've already mentioned is packing the courts. So those are, it's not that any of those things are completely new, but the combination of the power of fear, the power of racism, all these powers that flow from this dysfunctional approach to politics that's very calculated and I fear very effective, means that just even it seems to me that one of the foundations of a peaceful society, within the framework of all the struggle that we'll probably need to talk about, but within that framework, one of the most important nonviolent things that hold a society together are free and fair elections. Yeah. And when you have an authoritarian party that is committed to do all the things that I just named, that's a different level of threat. And I think we have to be very strategic, and I'll say more about that when we talk about solutions, in terms of the variety of activities that we need to be taking to confront this new threat.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, Jack. It's a powerful analysis. Sam, how about you? What's your assessment of the status of our democracy?
I want to first say thank you, Jack, for all you said in response to the first question and the second. I want to pick up on something you said in response to the first question. In your critique of representative democracy, I think it's important to recognize that democracy is a dialectical relationship between what we make it from social movement pressure and the way that existing systems, not yet composted, respond to those pressures from below. And I think you can make the argument that it is the social movements emerging from people who have not benefited from American democracy, who have helped stage the different advances of democracy up to the present time. So it's important to sustain the principled struggle. And when we look at that dialectic of principled struggle and response, we think about the George Floyd uprising in that particular moment. A lot of people believed falsely that it was a new moment. And in some ways it is a new moment, because people who had never before really thought about the intersectionality of racial justice and climate justice, just around the connotation of I can't breathe, began to recognize that what, from all of the recent, assassinations of Black men by police, from Trayvon Martin, or Trayvon Martin not killed by the police, but, by somebody acting on behalf of the police in this community. We have seen this notion of two climates made by racism and climate change. One is the inhospitable climate of structural racism and genocide. And the second is the inhospitable climate of climate apartheid, where the physical forcing of climate change is having much greater impacts on the people who did not cause the climate crisis. So as we think about where we stand in democracy, I think it's important to look at the pattern. The George Floyd uprising came, and in the year after George Floyd's murder, there were more police murders of Black people than in the 5 previous years. We would have liked to see that relationship not be that. We would have liked to have seen a proportional shift, Because of the George Floyd uprising, police killings of Blacks went down, but instead the opposite happened, which is a signal of extreme intransigence. So we're in a moment of pretty ridiculous intractability, where people are refusing to be in dialogue. And I think one of the most important things we need to do is critique that our current model of democracy fails to offer us spaces of healing our relations across our deeply organized divides. So one of the things we have to think about as we go back to the East Coast, the Northeast Coast, the New England states that had this practice of town hall forums, granted, they were largely homogenous. So it's easier to have a dialogue with people who look like you and, all of you, sort of, sing the same songs and dance the same dances. But we really need to go back to these town halls, but they need to be deeply democratic town halls, going back to the practices of assembly and using assembly as a place to bring people's different notions, their dreaming, their concerns together into a space where we can work it out with each other through this practice of principled struggle. So I want to share some perspectives from some of the journalists and activists and scholars that have thought about this. So Cameron Abadi with Foreign Policy asked the question, can we tackle climate change if we are not a democracy? He says democracy works by compromise, but climate change is precisely the type of problem that seems to not allow for it. As the clock on those climate timelines continues to tick, the structural mismatch is becoming increasingly exposed. And as a result, those concerned by climate change, some already with political power, others grasping for it, are now searching for and finding new ways of closing the gap between politics and science by any means necessary. David Linval at the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance adds to this, climate change actions in democracies face perceived challenges such as short-term bias in decision-making, policy capture or inconsistency, weak accountability mechanisms, and the permeability of policy-making processes to interests adverse to fighting climate change through the role of money in politics. And Jack talked about that already, about this increasing role of money in politics. And I'll go back to 1968 when Martin Luther King Jr. gave that speech on behalf of the sanitation workers. That for me was the beginning of the environmental justice movement. And it was also the beginning or the midwifing of neoliberalism, which is a gloves-off form of economic violence spread across the planet, which we call globalization. And so through neoliberalism, we've seen not just here in the United States, but all over the world, picking up what Jack talked about, the actual defeat and destruction of democracies and the assassination of democratic leaders around the world in the name of American patriotism and American prosperity. We have to collectively take account for that and take responsibility for it, whether we're Republican, Democratic, or agnostic on politics. And we don't have a process in this society to bring us together across our divides. And I said that out loud, but it's actually not true. We have processes, we're not using them. We need to go back to using those processes we have so that we can actually come into the kinds of dialogues that move us forward as a society. Jack talked about the right to vote and about the active campaigns of suppression of the right to vote happening all across the country. We can also add to this, picking up on Eisenhower's military industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, which has disenfranchised millions of voters across the country, and far too many of them are in Black bodies or Indigenous bodies. And then we have to think about the disproportionate impacts of the Holocaust of the climate crisis on poor frontline communities in the United States and around the world. And as they make their demands for climate justice, do we have mechanisms in place to listen to them, affirm what they're saying, and work with it? The answer right now is sufficient conditions are not yet in place. Rebecca Willis wrote this great book, Too Hot to Handle, Democracy and the Climate Crisis. And she reminds us of what Winston Churchill said. Democracy is the worst form of government except all the others. So if democracy is still the best of the limited alternatives, how might we advance it? So to advance democracy, she asks a strategic question. Is the problem that there's too much democracy or too little? And she says there's too little democracy. So to go back to Jack's question, answer to the first question, when we think about representative democracy, the driver for representative democracy's evolution is participatory democracy from below. Participatory democracy from below has been largely homogenized in terms of being monolithic culturally, monolithic in terms of, gender, orientations, monolithic in terms of geographic orientations. So we all sort of default back to echo chambers of the familiar.
Yes.
And in order for democracy to advance in step with the climate crisis, we have to use open science partnerships and really practice democracy as though our own lives depend on it. And the only way to sustain our own lives is to sustain the lives of everybody else. If we just think about our own lifeboat and not about the well-being of people around us, we're all going to perish. I gave a talk a few days ago, which sort of mirrors the talks I've been giving on this for several years. And people always say to me, Sam, the climate crisis is so severe, we don't have the luxury to worry about all those justice issues you think are critical. And I say it's absolutely false.
Yes.
The climate crisis is bringing more people together, facing a common set of consequences than ever before, yet uneven as they are. There's enough similarity of the way that the climate crisis is impacting well-being of people in Minnesota, in Bangladesh, in Colombia, that we now need to think about ways we can bring together a discourse that actually heals all of our divides and helps us really practice our life forward as earthlings, and get beyond the social contract that privileges economic fundamentalism. So at the root of this is really that notion of economic fundamentalism. We privilege the economic might of the powerful against the well-being of the earth and all of her people. That is the status of democracy. It's been hijacked by people whose will is a will to money and power. We can't allow that. We have more power than they do, and we need to take our power back collectively, not against each other. So I'll stop there.
Yes. Wow. It's very powerful the way that you're just articulating that the democracy is almost the antidote to this economic fundamentalism, and that it is the thing that can unify us for a collective well-being. Jack, as you hear Sam sharing that and thinking about how democracy is an essential part of tackling the climate crisis, what thoughts do you have about that, the role of democracy in tackling the climate crisis?
I think he's exactly right. The question I'll ask him, I'll say a few more things about what you just asked me, but when I entered the political arena, which was not a comfortable arena for me, I did that, and my vision of politics, I think, builds on what Sam said, because when I look, this is looking towards solutions. What I think is that we really need, and what I would have tried to use if I was on the inside, would have been to use my voice to help build what I call a movement of movements, because that's the democratic movement that I think we need, and it is climate, and climate is the existential ones, but so is healthcare, and so is housing. I mean, they're all critical. And when I even look at many polls, and many of the programs that many of us probably in this forum would support, they're actually very popular, and they're popular, and yet they get undermined because of what Sam said, the influence of money, the dominating images of fear, all the things that divide us. I love the idea of returning to the kind of town hall forums, but in a more diverse environment. Yeah. But my question, maybe I can ask you this, Sam, because what I wonder about, I'll just tell you in my own life, I confess, and this is probably very bad of me that I've done this, but I tend to look at movement of movements and think, boy, there's a very big range of people there that should be part of the kind of forums that you're talking about, because we have differences as well. But there's a lot of possibility there. And I think, as you say, climate should be one of the uniting things because it's so vital, right? But then and then I think, and there's a lot of people that probably don't see the world the way I do, and we probably have quite a few differences. But boy, I think we have a lot to learn from each other. And I think at our heart, if we can have a relationship, we probably would be building something together, which again is what a democracy should allow us to do. And then I will tell you that I have just blocked off and saying, it's not that I don't care about people who are outside that framework, who I think are just so, I would say many people, at least some of them who are supporters of Donald Trump, I think there's a lot of things we can talk to them about. I really do. But there's a certain group that I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to change them because I think it feels more like beating our heads against a wall. So I wonder, Sam, as you think about the town halls and even my concept of a movement of movements, do you just want to target everyone and everything, or do you make some of those divisions like I end up making just strategically about I'm one person and how much time do I have and what are the realistic prospects of doing X, Y, and Z?
Really important question for all of us, Jack. So thanks for asking it. I think about the practice of relational organizing as key here. There are people who are not going to listen to anything I say. But let's say you and I share a beloved community circle, and we map our circles of influence, and we recognize that somebody who is intractable to me is not intractable to you, or not intractable to Leah. We designate the person who has enough influence to get to the heart beneath the head of the person who is intractable to the demands of a particular social movement to come into a slight amount of alignment. And once a person has a homeopathic dose of alignment, a ripple begins to happen in their spirit, which opens them to more change. So we've seen Klansmen and people in white supremacist hate groups come to the other side, right? We have seen people apologize for massive, crimes, against people and humanity, and work to come to the other side and fight in solidarity with the calls for justice and common well-being. So I think that it's important for us, Jack, to recognize that we each have a non-excludability principle to live by, but that doesn't mean I have the capacity to reach you. So I'll make an effort to reach people. I'll learn from what happens in that interaction, and I'm not going to blame them if I can't reach them. I'm going to recognize that I am not the right person to reach them, but I am not going to say you're unreachable, because then I might as well be Hitler once I start saying that. And we can't afford to use evil to practice commonality. So mutuality requires the practice of beloved community. We have to kind of stay in that lane. So we'll take an example from the marriage amendment work. I was one of the many people who believe that's not going to pass. There's too many people 100% opposed, 200% opposed, right? And yet it passed because of great relational organizing using exactly the process that I just talked about. So the question for me, that was something at a small scale with very little risk to anybody's real well-being. The climate crisis is impacting everybody's well-being, and it's global in scale, and it transcends the capacities of any nation. There is no nation on earth that can compel the rest of the world to climate change and climate justice. We have to do this collectively. So it's a bigger question than what can we do here in the United States of America. A lot of people say America must lead and America must practice its own leadership, but we can't practice American exceptionalism anymore. We have to practice a true spirit of beloved community with all people, whether they are in a represented nation or not. We have just under 200 nations that are recognized by the United Nations and more than 6,000 that are not. Those 6,000 unrecognized nations are just as important to me as the nations that are recognized. The people who are homeless and in refugee camps are just as important to me as people who are scrapping just to sustain their houses and sustain their jobs. All lives matter. And because all lives matter, we have to practice a respect, a love, an appreciation for the diversity of our life streams and our ways of living, and learn how to be in relationship across our differences. And so, Jack, partly what you're speaking to is that we each have to take responsibility and heal through the ways we've been trained to exclude certain people from the conversation or believe we have to do it without them. Because as long as we do that, I think we're going to notice that this problem continues to persist. So a different imagination, as Einstein talked about it, is necessary to grapple with this climate crisis. A different imagination about democracy and a different imagination about human relationships across the divisions of race, class, gender, and all the other isms that we've used to harm ourselves and harm each other and fail to practice democracy.
Mm. That lands with me. That lands really with me. I like that homeopathic dose of alignment, that we each have our circles and networks, and might not be the person to do that homeopathic dose, but somebody who I'm in relationship with might be in relationship to be able to offer that.
Yeah. And because of the urgency of the climate crisis, we have to, there's this indigenous notion of mending the sacred hoop. And so I think that's a really powerful notion, which I like. So as we think about who are we closed off from, and we wake up in the morning and we say, I want the universe to help me come into alignment or come into relationships so alignment becomes possible with the people who are not in the sacred hoop in which I live my life. How can I be a resource for the mending of those relationships? If each one of us takes responsibility for that, and every day we're in dialogue with people in our influence networks about how we're doing that collectively, then more is possible. The climate crisis is knocking on our door, and it's eroding our landscapes, and it's making our lives more perilous and costly on a continuing basis, particularly for people in the global South. So we really need to think about relational organizing at a much greater pace than we ever have before. Yes. So there's no space, let me just say this out loud, there is no space for the continuation of racism and patriarchy. Mm-hmm. There's no space.
Yes.
It's time to hospice both of those things.
Yes. So
that we can come together across all of our ingrained divisions. Because if we don't, we die. It's that simple.
Yeah.
So let's move into the hopeful conversation about
how do we let's avoid the death, and what can we do to take action in this moment to midwife in some of these new imaginations of how democracy can operate, new imaginations of relationships with each other as humans across planetary beings.
So I've been talking for a bit, Jack, so you can go first.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to think of how I want to proceed. And I think I'm going to actually maybe move us back in a different direction a little bit. And then you can go any way that you want. In my quickest way, what I want to try to do is highlight the link between our present climate crisis and our present political crisis. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to do this in a very oversimplified way. But when I talk to people about climate, oftentimes I try to say politically, I'm going to narrow it down to 4 common ways to look at climate change. The first, and not too surprisingly, is those that say it's a hoax. And unfortunately, a very significant, and I'm going to be political here, a very significant number of Republicans that is their view, including former President Donald Trump. So a second perspective where people can land, and we hear this quite a bit, is, well, planet may be warming, may not be warming, but if it is, it doesn't have anything to do with us. So in other words, we can go on burning fossil fuels, we can burn coal, we can do all these things, no problem. And again, that is overwhelmingly inhabited in the world of the Republican Party in terms of its approach to climate. Third perspective is much more common within the Democratic Party, I would say nationally in the state of Minnesota, and that is climate change is real, it's urgent, we got to take action. But overwhelmingly, the idea for most is that what we really need to do is create clean energy so that we can live the way that we're now living. We're just going to substitute clean energy for dirty energy and then just keep going.
Yeah.
Well, that's that space is inhabited, I would say, overwhelmingly within the Democratic Party. The fourth position is actually my own. And I think it's yes, climate change is urgent. Yes, it's absolutely critical that we act. It's an existential kind of threat to life on planet Earth. But the changes that are required are much deeper than simply substituting clean energy for dirty energy. Mm-hmm. And my simplest way of saying this is that as I look at the purpose of economics, the way I would say it is the purpose of the economy is to produce the necessary goods for meaning-based societies. The purpose of the economy is to produce the things that we need: healthcare, housing, food, in sustainable ways that create space and enough justice so that we can live in healthy, sustainable, meaning-based societies. In other words, it's a shift away from material overabundance to greater justice. And in that fourth category, it would fit in with what Sam is saying about clean energy isn't necessarily going to solve environmental racism. You know, there's a lot of things that are going into that. So within that framework that I've just offered, and within our political context, I think what makes it so dangerous is that, again, we now have one political party that is committed to authoritarianism and undermining democracy. Yeah. And it's that same political party that is also committed to the policies that will mean the destruction of planet Earth. Mm-hmm. And so from my vantage point, the urgent situation, in addition to the depth, Sam, it's the first time I've heard you. I really appreciate the really incredible insights that you're offering. And in the midst of that, I can't lose sight of the fact that our present situation is really precarious. And one of the really important things that has to happen at all levels of governance is to stop the Republican Party. And in the state of Minnesota, for example, I think one of my priorities as I think about what do we do now is I'm going to try to identify, I did this last time as well, I think probably can identify 5 to 7 key Senate races in the state of Minnesota that offer a really good possibility of flipping the Senate back into Democratic control. If that happens, does that solve all of our problems with climate? No, it does not. But does it open up possibilities for meaningful changes that are being blocked now? Absolutely, it does. And that same, so maybe this fits into Sam's idea of how we broaden our networks in relational ways, because I think we probably don't win if we just focus on the message of saving our democracy, although I think we need to be talking about that much more. I think we need to be talking about how important saving democracy is to having healthy neighborhoods, to having healthcare, to having the water quality in Minnesota not continue to be destroyed. All the climate goals that I have will not happen without a functional democracy. And right now, the greatest dysfunction in the democracy, and I know there are many, I've tried to name some of them, Sam, you've named them, but right now, the biggest obstacle that we have is this authoritarian-driven, climate-denying party that is committed to holding and gaining power through a kind of any means necessary that I find absolutely terrifying. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jack.
Maybe rather than stop there. That doesn't mean that I don't have ideas about what we should be doing. In fact, I offered one. That's one very practical thing coming up in Minnesota elections. Yes. Is that we don't willy-nilly get involved We have to be targeted, but I think there's a very real prospect of identifying strategically 5 to 7 races that could flip the state of Minnesota back, and that would have tremendous environmental implications for the state of Minnesota.
Yes.
So we're getting close to the time we want to invite questions and open the floor to a feedback loop with me and Jack and Leah. So there's a lot I want to try and say and cram into a few minutes here. So, forgive me for what I don't manage to fit into a few minutes here. But a place to start is with alternative constructions of another possible world. So one alternative, construction has come from the Red, Black, and Green New Deal, put together by the Movement for Black Lives. And they have 6 pillars in their framework. One is water, energy, land, labor, economy, and democracy. And I am, in dialogue and working to add a 7th pillar, which is open science. So to talk about that in the context of the 9-point plan of the Red, Black, and Green New Deal, honor the water. If we really honored the water, we wouldn't have done line 3 as one example. The Native people said very clearly, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. And they were proven right. Enbridge said, it's not realistic for us to honor all of the stringent requirements you're putting into these water permits. So we just want you to know, as you authorize us to have the water permit, we need to build this pipeline. We're going to fail sometimes, right? And they were right. They failed sometimes. So honoring the water is critical. Democratizing energy is critical. And if we democratize energy and do what Jack talks about and move towards this clean energy economy, I need us to transcend thinking about just how that's good for America. I need us to think about the Democratic Republic of the Congo that has the cobalt that's needed to make the batteries for these electric vehicles. And we have failed the Congo since the 1884 Berlin Conference. They gave it to, this slime bag as a personal kind of property. And then we go through the first, African war in the Congo and the second African war in the Congo. And the continuing strife imposed on Black bodies and indigenous and peasant bodies and women's bodies across the global South. As we think about democratizing energy, we also have to reconcile ourselves with this. This is going to be a hard thing for many of you to hear. This notion of property is theft. And so as indigenous people say, we don't want a land acknowledgement. We want you to think about right relationships with us. And that means making sure that the way we relate on the land allows us to practice our full sovereignty, which means food sovereignty is included in that and cultural sovereignty is included in that. So we have to think about, what does it look like for us to free the land and free ourselves in relation to the land? A great friend of mine who moved to the United States from Somalia, because she bought the dream. This is a land of milk and honey. And she got here and said, Sam, I thought I was coming to a place where my life would be better, but America is just stuck in rush mode. I feel like I'm on a treadmill and I don't have time to breathe. I don't have time to visit. I have lost conversational capacity being here in America because my life is a mad rush. I feel mad in my soul. And I need to go back to Africa so I can recover myself, right? So freeing the land and freeing ourselves. Thinking about reimagining labor is one of their points. Ending extractive economies. And this is a point hard to hear in America at this present time. Restore stolen Black capital, which means the call for climate reparations. And advance a form of democracy that's fit for the flourishing of both people and planet. Root all of our policies in the right to breathe, and a declaration of climate and racial urgency, and then global South solidarity. These are their critical pillars. So taking these pillars into my own day-to-day work, I've thought about how can I practice these things instead of just talking about them. So I have a long list of ways in which I'm actively embodying these things that come through the Red Deal by Native nations, and also the Red, Black, and Green Deal from the Movement for Black Lives. But nothing I do is going to add up to, more than dust in the wind, unless we really learn how to work together as good relatives. So for me, that's the fundamental thing that I'm asking of us, is along with a minister in the parliament in the UK, David Lammy. He says the climate emergency is colonialism's natural conclusion. The climate emergency is colonialism's natural conclusion. So I think there's something in what he is saying there that we all need to reckon with. A way of being that shaped modernity, which is based on what Vandana Shiva defined as the division of humans from nature, the division of humans from each other, and the internalization of a practice of division in our own spirits, in our own relational ecosystems, where we all reinforce a world that continues to fall apart and doesn't know how to come back together. So for me, that's the definition of apartheid. Yeah. We're living in a global apartheid dynamic, and none of us know how to find a way back into healthy relationship with each other or with the earth. But those are the two mandates. Honor the earth as though your life depends on it, and honor the lives and well-being of people who are not in your kindred circle as though they are part of your necessary kindred circle. And if we do that, then we begin to heal all of these things that divide us, and we can have a prosperous people on a prosperous planet. Thank you.
I really appreciate the wisdom and the two different yet interwoven frames, like Jack having a very pragmatic political, like, who can we have as our elected representatives and as our elected leaders who can guide us into opening up more possibilities for what democracy can be. And then Sam, you're like really just imagining this whole different way of being in relationship with all things, the land, each other, what an economy means, which that also leads back to what Jack was saying about, like, the fourth way here is economy is not producing goods for consumption. It's meaningful. It's meaning. What is the meaning that we have in our life? There is just a lot, and we want to make sure that all of the people who are here participating in this conversation have a chance to weigh in with questions that you may have based on what you've heard Sam and Jack share. So now is the time. We're going to open up the chat, and please, those burning questions, this is a opportunity to ask them. And while people are finding their questions and typing in their questions, I'll just say thank you again to the Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers for hosting this forum, and to say thank you for the many organizations that co-sponsored tonight's event. There was a number of different groups: Citizens for Global Solutions Minnesota, Friends for a NonViolent World, Indivisible Minnesota, Minnesota Move to Amend, Nonviolent Peace Force, VoteClimate.org, and Walker Community United Methodist Church. So much good work is being done by all these organizations, and when we think about being in relationship, I really think that MAP's vision of creating a cooperative experience of organizations and individuals who believe in nonviolent social change, who are wanting to imagine new things, like, that is a lot of what the vision of MAP has been and is. And so I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful for the richness of our community here and the resources that Sam and Jack have been sharing with us as well. Okay, so we're going to see if there's any good questions that have been popping up. What do you want to hear Sam and Jack speak more on? And I think Terry's and some other folks are kind of looking in the chat to find those gems of questions.
I see that Rebecca Kramer put in the chat, let's proceed with a movement of movements that Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers has started. I think that's right on, and I think a question for MAP to ask itself is, who is in that alliance?
Yes.
And how do we begin to make that alliance equally resonant with people who do not right now see it as our movement?
Yes.
So I think that's an important challenge for the Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers to take up. And just to share one story, When myself and a colleague started the Environmental Justice Coordinating Council in North Minneapolis, we went in and talked to people in the community about why African American people were not directly involved in the environmental movement. And the question we ask is, when you think about the environment, what are the first things that come to mind for you? And this is going to be kind of remarkable for you. They said two things. We think about air, soil, and water, just like everybody else, but we also think about white people, because white people have overly framed what the environmental movement is about, and they don't understand what Nathan Hare said in this really important article in 1970, Black Ecology, that we have a very different environment than white people have. You have amenities, we have air we can't breathe. You have good schools and parks, we have, police shootings, and we have, community-based violence and community-based unsafety norms that are emerging because of the inhospitable environment we live in. So we have to really think about, how do we build and braid heterogeneously or diversely our movements so that they resonate with all people from all places. That's intercultural work.
Yes.
And that's difficult work to do, but I think that there's no excuse any longer for each of us not to be really stretching our capacities every single day to be more intercultural. So I'll stop there to make space for the other questions that are starting to come in.
Yes. I think your point is very well taken, and in a way that ties back to the relational organizing model, that it is through those relationships that we have with one another that we can come together and identify what is that the direction that we want to move, not just what's good for me, but what will sustain all of us.
Yeah, I just want to, before you pick up, I want to quickly respond to Mariam's question. And what Mariam is talking about is intersectionality, without using that word. We can focus on the climate crisis without focusing on how all of the other issues that matter to us are imbricated or are part of the climate crisis. So as we think about the Millennium Ecosystem Report in 2005 that documented that 16 of 24 core ecosystem services on which all our lives depend were in significantly degraded status. As scholars looked at that loss of biodiversity, as we think about the climate crisis, we have to think about, how is that loss of biodiversity related to the ongoing genocide against indigenous nations on the planet? Indigenous nations are only 4% of the world population, and yet 80% of our remaining land that is biodiversity rich is in the hands or in the ecosystems where Native people live. So honoring Native lives is the key to protecting biodiversity, which is one of the most important keys to carbon sequestration and addressing the climate crisis. So that sort of gets at part of Miriam's question. I just wanted to make sure we got that in. Thanks for that point, Miriam.
If I see a couple of the things in the chat too, just a couple of quick things. One, feel free to share, or I can share my email address. Someone's asking about the 5 to 7 Senate districts, and I have a few already in mind, and I'm consulting a number of people, but if you email me and ask me, I will keep you in the loop of what I'll be doing and what some other people will be doing. So it's just my name all run together without a hyphen at gmail.com. So Jack Nelson-Pallmeyer at gmail.com. Tell me you're interested, and I'll keep you informed as I move forward. And then the question about how do we maintain a balance building an independent, nonpartisan organization and working to get Democrats elected. You don't want to be perceived as an arm of the DFL, or is the GOP so far gone? I would say, yes, the GOP is so far gone, but if that is a real concern for your organization, I think there are ways of doing that. And I think Sam has actually hit on some of them. And I mentioned too, that almost any important issue that you can think of that people are concerned about, housing costs or healthcare or climate change, the quality of water, many of them, you can organize a conversation around and include GOP and DFL candidates. You could even post their positions that they put on their website, and it's not going to take a rocket scientist very long to to be drawn to one or the other of these candidates, because in many cases it's just that clear cut. So in other words, there are ways to be engaged politically and even framing things in ways that could probably be helpful to a Democratic candidate if you don't want to be directly, your organization can't directly sponsor a PFL candidate. So I would just say that there are ways around that.
And I like that. It kind of ties to the things that worked in the democratic processes of our nation as it was being born, and having those public forums and town hall conversation forums, but focusing on the issues and what are the platforms that are being lifted up by the candidates, and taking out that partisan rhetoric, and instead thinking about what are the goals that we have in our community. I think I like that, Jack.
Now, one last thing. Someone mentioned that we haven't used the word fascism, and I would say I don't throw the word around, but I don't think it is wrong that we use it. That I think we're not there yet, but I would say the foundation in moving in that direction is rather frightening. What has happened in the last several years, and I think what is actually likely to happen throughout in the aftermath of this upcoming electoral cycle. So I do want to suggest to people who aren't worried about whether or not you are going to get in trouble if you are too partisan. I think it is very, very important that we talk about authoritarianism, and you can use the word fascism as you want. Sometimes I think it may be better to talk about authoritarianism just because it may open a conversation more than simply the word fascism. But I don't think it's wrong to be thinking, or should we be worried about fascism? I would say, yeah, I think that's an important thing to be concerned about.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this notion of fascism and just sort of talk about the tilt that I feel like we're in the world as a whole. I think there are an abundance of signals which indicate that we are moving towards an eco-authoritarian, kind of world ecology, where nations sort of close their borders and, steal the resources of other peoples and lands in order to take care of their own well-being. And we're seeing this, all across the continent of Africa and all over South America. And so if we don't want the world to tilt towards eco-fascism, we have to ask ourselves, what's the alternative tilt that we want to collectively organize? And we have to give a clear enough expression of it that we can actually embody it, which means we can actually, as Leah was doing with us in the exercise at the beginning of this, it has to be something we can breathe in and breathe out easily in all of our relationships, which means it's a deep knowing, what Rastas call an overstanding of something as opposed to an understanding of something. So what is that alternative? I've defined that alternative as an intercultural ecological democracy based on open science partnerships at all scales everywhere in the world. So every elementary school is going to take responsibility, along with every middle school and high school and community college and university, for using learning as an opportunity to pay attention to the well-being of people in ecosystems on which our lives depend. And that's the school. The school is focused on well-being, as opposed to helping us be robots to find someplace to fit in an economy that makes more and more people across the planet increasingly precarious. So I think about the kind of organizing that was done in the late 1960s to help people recognize that we might think we're enemies, but we just haven't learned how to be friends yet. And so I think that's a mantra that I want us all to kind of take in and practice. We might think we're enemies, but we just haven't learned how to be friends yet. Let's do what Donna Haraway, the feminist and technologist and utopian, talks about, which is making kin with all of life. Staying with the trouble, noticing where you've got an edge that you don't know how to cross, and lean into it and say, this is my purpose right now, is to stay here until I can figure out how to relate here. And if we do that, we start to work past these eco-fascist divides, which is a closure of the conversation around something really narrow that doesn't really have enough breathing space even to live itself. And so I think as we teach people about how living systems work, which is part of the open science work, people begin to maybe unfold from this frozen posture of militant flight, fight, freeze, or fawn.
Mm-hmm. I love that, leaning into the edge until we're able to be in that.
And just the thing on the Republicans, you know, the Republicans were the party of Lincoln. They were the ones who brought the emancipation, so-called, of slavery, which still exists today. I mean, there's more slaves in the world system today than there were in 1865. So we haven't gone in the right direction around the question of slavery. The Haitian Revolution, which, you know, was the first nation in the world to end slavery, is still an active, you know, thing that we need to join with and continue that work to abolish all forms of slavery and all forms of oppression on the planet. And we can't do that by leaving out people who are currently aligned with Republican formations. Republican formations change over time. Democratic formations change over time. Non-aligned formations change over time. Whatever formation someone's in, they are your relative. Figure out a way to close the distance.
There's some good questions in the chat kind of tying to that of what about the RCV and other electoral reforms? Should we be asking candidates what measures they will support to bring forward to move us past this bipartisan binary?
Well, I would say yes. I think making some of those changes really it strengthens the representative democracy, and it opens up possibilities for getting past some of the polarization. And I think that in every setting that we're in, we should be linking. We all have issues that we're most identified with, you know, and that's okay. I think Sam has made a really good case that wherever our starting point is, we're neighbors and part of the same community in a way. But I would say, so whatever your issue is that you are most engaged in and that your community circle is engaged in, I would say to include what is happening to our democracy in however you're framing that issue is really vital.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that to pick up on what Jack is saying, this is democratic mapping process. We start by people being in dyads, one-to-one conversations. What are the issues that matter most to you? And how is our current political ecosystem supporting the addressing of those things to your satisfaction or not? Mm-hmm. And then I'll share what's most up for me and talk about my satisfaction or dissatisfaction. And then we ask, what would it look like to create a political order in which both those things that concern you most and concern me most are both met? Mm-hmm. And then those two people join a group of another two, and then those four join another group of four, and then those 8 join another group of 8, and then those 16 join another group of 16. And you just keep on populating up to increase in complexity all of these things that matter to us. And I'm saying this out loud partly to make sure that before we close, I get to Mariam's last question, which is, how do we overcome fear in white peoples? Mm-hmm. And I think part of how we overcome the fear is by helping people realize that even though we're not all the same, we have enough in common. And even when we don't have things in common, we have a capacity to meet each other in the middle and recognize, even if it's agonistic, that we share the earth and we have to figure out how to stay in good relation with each other. And when people trust that we can have differences and remain in good relation, that dispels the fear. But as long as we live in such hyper segregated realities where white people can go about their day-to-day business without ever interacting with us on an equal level, how can they not be afraid? They have benefited from a politics and a structural organization of apartheid in which fear is self-organizing. Mm-hmm. Because white people live in white spaces, work in white spaces, worship in white spaces, play in white spaces. Mm-hmm. And in very few of those spaces do the rest of us have a chance to equally be present. Mm-hmm. As long as that's true, fear will continue. Mm-hmm. People are afraid of things they don't understand. At least here in an individualist culture,
Yeah.
we are afraid of things we don't understand. In an indigenous culture, something new is like, oh, let me learn. This is something new in my environment. Let me learn. Instead of fear, there's an appreciation. If we could move from an appreciation of difference as opposed to a rejection of difference, we could actually open ourselves to true democracy.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I thought that Donald Trump was going to win the first election with Hillary Clinton. And I was among the few people in my circle, at least, that thought that was possible. And one of the things that convinced me was not only did I think people would show their racism more just by in the voting booth than we're showing to polls, but when I heard that something like 2/3 of Americans said if they had a $500 unexpected bill, it would throw their lives into kind of economic chaos, or they would really have trouble. And so I want to say that I think in addition to, or another reason why we can build alliances, including with white people, is that there are many white people in this country whose healthcare sucks, who are also really struggling, and in that climate, that's why the Republican one of those pillars that they're using is fear, is because it takes attention away from all the things that unite us, and is intentionally meant to keep us apart, and we have to find ways of addressing that, I think. I see in the thing, and I know you probably mentioned it, but I really hope that a lot of people, and I plan on being there on May 4th, go to the Capitol for the Rally for Democracy. I don't know who put that in there. Did Terry? To everyone, yeah. Just so that's one thing a lot of us, if we're available, and I'm actually retired now from the University of St. Thomas, so I have a lot of, more time in my schedule. So I will be there, and I hope a lot of people will.
I want to just note the question that Polly Kellogg asked. Hey, Polly, great to see you again. Of, thinking about Indivisible as a great example of a grassroots organization that both has local capacity and national capacity. And so she's asking, what are the other groups out there that are like that? And I think that part of our work of closing our own social distance is just to begin to bring a question like Polly is asking into all of the dialogues we have, from our morning coffee to our evening cup of hot milk, or whatever we might consume to help us rest and get into just sleep mode, and sort of live in that conversation and actually build a comprehensive map that keeps on getting more and more comprehensive, because there's a lot of organizations out here that are doing this kind of work. Many of them are invisible by design. If you think about my own organization, Embody Deep Democracy, when I'm not doing my work at Rainbow Research, we created a website many, many years ago. It hasn't been updated since 2013, because we're not talking about any of the underground, undercommons work that we're doing from 2013 to the present. We will at some point, but we haven't talked about it. So there's a lot of organizations that you don't know until you come into relationships with people who are doing that work. So continue organizing the ripple ecology of more and more relationship, and also recognize this aspect of the divide. Because of the politics of repression, given the opposition to even allowing critical race theory to be taught in schools, and the governor of Florida saying that nobody's going to be allowed to talk about equity anymore in the state of Florida. I mean, this is like pretty insane. And so a lot of folks in Black bodies, in Native bodies, in Latinx bodies, in lesbian, queer, bisexual, trans, gender nonconforming bodies are saying, I am going to be in places that aren't toxic to me. And that means they're practicing the same politics of being in closed off spaces as they have learned from the practices of whiteness. And so we have echo chambers, but we don't have middle spaces that bring us together. We need to organize more middle spaces that actually allow for a convening across our differences. That's one of the most important forms of a new democratic architecture, is to take responsibility to create a space like that in your neighborhood, in your church, in your organization, so that all of us are a resource for closing the divides. So probably there's lots of organizations out there, but one of the divides we have to attend to is the flow of funding. And there's an active repression in terms of a refusal to fund organizations coming from BIPOC communities at scale. So we have a lot of groups that start up, but they're never given enough money to grow to scale. And for those few that do grow to scale, as you grow to scale, you tend to lose your capacity to stay deep in relationship. You become more of a program that's imposing design on people as opposed to lifting design from dialogue. And so there's a challenge in growing. How do you grow in a way that stays democratic? This is one of the most important questions of the next 10 years. And I look forward to a flourishing of democratic experiments where we really learn how to stay in the relational organizing mode, and lift up each other's visions and dreams and combine them together in a braid of transformation.
Yes. I feel like I can't write fast enough. Thank goodness this is going to be recorded, or is being recorded, so we can watch it again and capture these gems and jewels over and over. There's one more question that was put in the chat that I think is worth addressing, which is around censorship and how we should consider the ways the Democratic Party promotes policies that are undemocratic too, and that Democrats are most vigorously advocating media censorship. Just your thoughts on some of the tactic of using censorship to accomplish one's goals, and how that plays into this conversation around democracy and climate change.
I'll let Jack take a stab at that since I've been talking for a bit. Jack's got his camera off at the moment. Are you there, Jack?
I am. I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to throw that question to you. I'm not sure exactly what to say about it. My first thought is just to know, to track more, and maybe I need to track more about the different levels of censorship and coming from each group, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. But I don't know who put the question in or exactly what it is, but I will say I'm somewhat worried about what transpired today, which is allowing a multi-billionaire to buy Twitter, and he supposedly is going to make it a space of unrestricted free speech. But given some of his proclivities and things that he said in the past, would make me think that is not likely to be an open forum that is going to be very helpful for people who are struggling at the margins. But the questioner may think that is a form of censorship to say that Donald Trump is banned from Twitter. I tend to appreciate that Donald Trump was banned from Twitter. So I think it's too hard of a question to answer without more of maybe that warrants another meeting, but I don't feel competent to answer because I don't know enough about where it's coming from.
Whatever is censored rises in another way. Whatever is censored rises in another way. So I think that we need to move from shutting down particular voices to organizing to prevent echo chambers of voices. So how do we do that? I'm not exactly sure. I mean, there are certainly some places I can't go into because my life would be at risk if I walked into those particular environments, and that's true for all of us. But I think that for those of us who are living at the intersection of deeper democracy and climate justice, we have an obligation to focus on organizing climate resilience, climate well-being in the communities that we have the greatest influence in relationship to. But then recognizing that no community is an island, we have to share this conversation from our island of resilience to all others. And that necessarily means getting into dialogue with people whose voices we don't yet know how to metabolize in a way that doesn't feel like a violent metabolizing for ourselves. So how do I listen to a voice that's oppositional to my life and to my well-being? Well, again, we have to go back to those conversations about relational organizing. I'm probably not the person to have that conversation because that person is already so out of their body by my mere presence that somebody who is able to be in presence with them has to begin that conversation and then close the circle. So this is uphill, but I don't think that censorship by the right or the left is the answer.
You know, I think the question more is directed to disinformation. With social media, there's so many more potential for disinformation. And so the question is, how do the platforms determine what is accurate and what is disinformation? And I think sometimes that's called censorship when it's really an attempt to eliminate some of the outright disinformation. If that
that's helpful. That's helpful. If I could just say one thing, it's a little bit different, but I just wanted to reiterate it, and that is that I really have appreciated, Sam, some of your challenges for us to think about the organizations that we're in and how we expand the space in terms of who we're interacting with, who we're learning from, who we're in conversation with. I also think it's important for each of us that are part of multiple organizations that, given our topic tonight, I would hope that in every setting that we find ourselves, that we won't hesitate to push questions that deal with, are we promoting really authentic democracy, or are we allowing it to be undermined? And are we really taking seriously climate change? Because I think just simple questions asked with those two issues in mind are extremely important, both for getting people to think about them and the urgency around both, but also really important just to open a conversation up, because I don't know that lots of people are thinking about climate change and our democracy in the same sentence. And that's what we've been doing tonight, which I think is actually really important in itself.
Yes. I'm so grateful for the way that both Jack and Sam, you have both been able to hold this intersectionality of democracy and climate change so well, and shared many ideas and strategies for things that we can do next. And I would love to just challenge everybody in this group to do exactly what Jack and Sam have been saying, is make that list, make that commitment, think about your life, your world, and what is something that you can do now and something you can do next. And it doesn't have to be, it's just little things, all these little things that we can weave into that way that we exist in the world. So just huge gratitude, and we are at time, so I'm gonna just invite people to unmute if you aren't able, but I'm going to give a big round of applause, and you can give a little cheer to say thank you to Sam and Jack for being with us tonight and sharing your wisdom. They both have generously, offered their contact information for us. So thank you for extending that relationship, and please know that MAP is here as well, and I think that we have heard loud and clear the challenges that our organization has to wrestle with as well, and to embody a more authentic democratic process in how we do our organizing work in a more relational way. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks to all the participants.
Thanks all.
Yep. Thank you, Sam.